Hello and welcome to this teleconference session. Today we will take up one of the topics from the Advanced Nutrition course, which is part of the Master's Program in Dietetics and Food Service Management. The topic for discussion is carbohydrates. Well, we all know that we need energy to carry out the various activities of the body. And where does this energy come from? Yes, it comes from the three major macronutrients. These are carbohydrates, fats and proteins. Among these three macronutrients, it is the carbohydrates which is one of the most important and abundant source of carbohydrates, which this provides energy. If you look at the entire spectrum, you would realize that approximately 60 to 70% of the total energy requirement of our body are met by carbohydrates. If you look at the screen now, if you look at the monitor, you would notice that this is the single most abundant source of dietary energy, which comprises 50 to 70% of the total energy intake in different populations. Therefore, carbohydrates are an important source of energy, and it is important for us to understand what are carbohydrates, what are its components, what are the food sources which provide carbohydrates, and what are the physiological effects of this important nutrient in our body. We will begin our discussion by first understanding, or rather classifying, carbohydrates. What are the different carbohydrates? Basically, carbohydrates can be simple carbohydrates or sugars. They are classified under these. They are classified as monosaccharides and disaccharides. Then there are oligosaccharides and the polysaccharides. Let us take each one of these classes one by one, and we will begin by the first class, which is the sugars or the monosaccharides and the disaccharides. As you can see on the monitors, monosaccharides, the examples, the most important is glucose, fructose and galactose. This is the simplest unit of a carbohydrate. We call them simple basic unit primarily because it cannot be hydrolyzed further. Other carbohydrates are broken down to produce these basic units. Therefore, monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, galactose. And the food sources, if you look at the monitor again, you would notice they are fruit, honey and milk and milk products. Moving from monosaccharides, let us move on to the second class, which is disaccharides. Disaccharides, the examples are maltose, lactose and sucrose. Now these disaccharides, when they are hydrolyzed, they yield two monosaccharides, primarily glucose, galactose or fructose. As you can notice, maltose when hydrolyzed yields two molecules of glucose, lactose will yield glucose plus galactose, and sucrose will yield glucose plus fructose. The important food sources are for maltose, glucose syrup. For lactose, it is milk and milk product. In fact, lactose is the carbohydrate present in milk, and sucrose, which is found in sugarcane and sugar used as additives. So this was the plain sugars or the simple carbohydrates. Let's move on to the second class of carbohydrates, which are the oligosaccharides. As you can see on the monitor now, you see among the oligosaccharides, depending on the unit of monosaccharides, they can be either classified as trisaccharides, tetrasaccharides, pentasaccharides. Let us begin with the trisaccharides. Raffinose and maltotriose are the examples of oligosaccharides, and raffinose on hydrolysis yields glucose, fructose, galactose. That means three units of basic carbohydrate or monosaccharide units. The examples, you will find raffinose in chickpeas, legumes, pulses. Similarly, maltotriose, which is a trisaccharide, is on hydrolysis yields three glucose molecules, and it is found in glucose syrup. Continuing our discussion on oligosaccharides, quickly let us look at the tetrasaccharides and the pentasaccharides. Maltotetrose, stechiose, this is the tetrasaccharides, and as you can see, the component monosaccharide unit present, 4 glucose molecules are yielded from maltotetrose, and the source is the glucose syrup. Similarly, pentasaccharides, verbascose is the example, and it is found in beans and legumes. Other than the oligosaccharides, the third class of carbohydrates are the polysaccharides, and they are one of the important sources or carbohydrates which have great physiological role in our body, about which we will talk subsequently later in this talk today. But just to tell you which are these polysaccharides, if you look at the monitors now, these polysaccharides are either starches or the non-starch polysaccharides. The starches are made up of amylose and amylopectin molecules, and you will find starches in wheat, rice, these are the cereals, potato, these are the sources of starches in our diet. Other than that, the non-starch polysaccharides, the dietary fiber, which is a very important aspect, we will take that later, a little while from now, but they are cellulose, hemicellulose, pectin, and they are found in fiber in vegetables, fruits, and we will learn more about their food sources in a little while from now. Now, this classification, what I have just talked about, this classification is based on the degree of polymerization. Therefore, carbohydrates can be classified based on the degree of polymerization into what we talked about as sugars like monosaccharides, disaccharides, into oligosaccharides, and into polysaccharides. Other than this, we can also classify carbohydrates based on their usage or the way they are utilized in the body, and based on this we can actually classify them into two, what we call as the available carbohydrates and the non-available carbohydrates. If you look at your monitors now, classification based on digestive weight of carbohydrate, how it is used up in the body. Available carbohydrates, these are digested to constituent monosaccharides and absorbed. All those carbohydrates which can be hydrolyzed, broken down and utilized in our body are the available carbohydrates. As compared to this, the other carbohydrates which cannot be utilized in the body, meaning that in our intestine we do not have the enzymes to break up these or digest these carbohydrates, and therefore they are called unavailable carbohydrates. Quickly, if you look at your monitor, this has been highlighted: available and unavailable carbohydrates which are not digested by the endogenous enzymes of the human intestinal tract. However, interestingly, it has been found that the unavailable carbohydrates, which we thought so far were unavailable, are actually not so unavailable, meaning that these two, once they are inside the intestine, can be utilized, can be used to provide energy. How? By the action of the bacteria. We know that there are about 400 species of bacteria inside the intestine, and they have a very symbiotic relationship, and these can actually ferment these unavailable carbohydrates, and these carbohydrates can be broken down and utilized to provide energy. Therefore, the FAO and WHO have now come up with a different classification for carbohydrates based on this aspect, and according to this, if you look at your monitors now, you will see that classification based on digestive weight. Based on this, we classify them as non-glycemic carbohydrates and glycemic. The non-glycemic carbohydrates are those, you see, the examples are given: raffinose series of oligosaccharides, the non-starch polysaccharides, some disaccharides such as lactulose and resistant starch, which is what? Which is part of the polysaccharides or the dietary fiber group. These are the non-glycemic carbohydrates. Let's move on to the glycemic carbohydrates. These are those that are digested to monosaccharides or hydrolyzed to monosaccharides and absorbed as such in the small bowel. They include the disaccharides, the starch, the maltodextrins, glycogen. All those which can be hydrolyzed, all carbohydrates which can be hydrolyzed are called the glycemic carbohydrates. So we want our learners to understand this new classification based on in terms of glycemic and the non-glycemic carbohydrates. With this basic classification of carbohydrates, let us move on to the functions. Why do we need carbohydrate? Obviously, the very first function, as we talked earlier, is the energy giving nutrient, that is the source of energy. Carbohydrates is the main source of energy in our diet, as 60 to 70% of our energy requirements are met by carbohydrates. Among this, glucose is the major source of energy. You know that 1 gram of carbohydrate provides 4 kilocalories. Therefore, glucose or the other fructose, galactose converted to glucose, and it is utilized by our body. Now that is a different aspect. How is glucose broken down? That is part of the nutritional biochemistry course. We will take it up subsequently, but here we need to understand that carbohydrate is the source of energy. Other than source of energy, another important aspect of carbohydrate is the protein sparing effect. What do we mean? See, carbohydrate helps in regulating the protein metabolism. Presence of sufficient carbohydrates to meet energy demands prevent the channeling of too much of protein for this purpose. What does this mean? This primarily means that, you see, like carbohydrates, proteins too can provide energy. 1 gram of protein actually provides 4 kilocalories also. Therefore, but what we need to understand here is that protein, the major function of protein is not for providing energy. It is for bodybuilding. Therefore, when enough carbohydrates are present in the diet, proteins are spared to carry out the bodybuilding function rather than being utilized for energy source, and therefore presence of carbohydrate is very important in our diet for sparing proteins. Therefore, this is the protein sparing function. Like its impact on protein metabolism, carbohydrates also are necessary for normal fat metabolism. And that is the third function of carbohydrates. If you look at your monitors, you would notice the antiketogenic effect. What is this? You need to understand this a little. You see, like proteins and carbohydrates, even fats, rather fats, are the concentrated sources of energy. 1 gram of fat provides 9 kilocalories as compared to 4 which is provided by carbohydrates and proteins. But when there is lack of carbohydrates in the diet, a lot of fats will be utilized or will be broken down, and in case of an incomplete breakdown, what will happen? Ketone bodies will accumulate in our body, and the body will not be able to handle this enhanced metabolism of fats, and it would lead to what you call as acidosis, sodium imbalance, and other such effects which are not good for the health. Therefore, some amount of carbohydrates, or rather carbohydrates, are important for a normal fat metabolism in our body. Other than the 3 major functions we have just talked about, the next function of carbohydrates, if you look at the monitor, is that it is a precursor. Carbohydrates act as precursor. Precursor for what? It acts as precursor to compounds such as nucleic acid, connective tissue matrix, galactosides of nerve tissues. You have heard of DNA, RNA. Well, DNA, deoxyribose nucleic acid. Well, carbohydrate in form of ribose is important for the formation of these nucleic acids. Like this, even the connective tissue matrix, the galactosides of nerve tissues, all these require carbohydrates. So these were the major functions of carbohydrates which we have just kind of reviewed. After functions then, the next important aspect which we need to understand about carbohydrates is the metabolic fate of carbohydrate. That is, what happens to the carbohydrate or a meal rich in carbohydrate, how it is absorbed, how it is metabolized, broken down, digested in our body. That is an important aspect, and let us look at it. If you look at your monitors now, you would notice that the hydrolytic enzymes involved in the digestion of carbohydrates are collectively called glycosidases or carbohydrases. And the major carbohydrate enzyme secreted by the salivary glands and the echinal cells of pancreas is the amylase. You might have heard of the salivary amylase and the pancreatic amylase. Yes, these are the major, or amylase is the major enzyme which is involved in the breakdown of carbohydrates in our body. Unlike protein and fat metabolism, the digestion of carbohydrates starts in the mouth itself. The salivary amylase is present in the mouth, which starts acting upon the carbohydrates and start breaking down these complex carbohydrates into simpler units, the basic units of carbohydrate. And if you get back to your monitors, you would notice that other than the amylase, the sucrose, lactose, these can be hydrolyzed by the enzymes called oligosaccharides. All this aspect has been beautifully summed up for you in your next slide, where we have given a flow, through a flow diagram we have tried to explain to you how the hydrolysis takes place. Take the example of starch. You see, starch is acted upon by the salivary amylase and the pancreatic amylase, and this is broken down into intermediate units called the isomaltose, maltose, maltotriose, and these are further acted upon by isomaltase acts upon isomaltose, maltase on maltose, and this is broken down into glucose. Glucose, which is the basic unit, and this is broken down to provide energy, carbon dioxide, water, which you will learn in your nutritional biochemistry program. Like starch, let's look at the other carbohydrates like sucrose, lactose, maltose. How are they digested in the body? If you look at the monitor, you look at it, sucrase, lactase, maltase. These are the respective enzymes which act upon sucrose, lactose, maltose. These are the disaccharides, and they are broken down into glucose plus fructose, sucrose. Lactose is broken into glucose plus galactose, and maltose into 2 units of glucose. So this is how the carbohydrates, whatever carbohydrates are eaten in the form of food, are hydrolyzed. As far as the polysaccharides are concerned, we said that our in the digestive system or in the intestine, there aren't any enzyme which helps in breakdown of these polysaccharides. However, the bacteria present can act on these carbohydrates, about which we will learn in a little while from now. Now, after the metabolism or the breakdown or digestion of carbohydrates, let's move on to absorption. How are these units, the basic units like glucose, fructose, galactose, how are they absorbed or taken up by the cells? Basically, if you look at your monitors, glucose and galactose are absorbed by active transport. This active transport requires a specific protein complex known as a sodium glucose transport protein, SGLT, and this is dependent on ATP and sodium molecule. Alright, so glucose and galactose is absorbed by active transport, whereas fructose is absorbed by a facilitative transport which requires a protein transporter. It is called GLUT, which is glucose transporter. Okay, and this entire absorption process is summarized for you in the next slide on your monitors. If you look at it, you see, I would like to just show it to you here. You look at this glucose and galactose, which is here. Now this requires, we said, an active transport system which requires sodium as well as energy, and this is facilitated by both sodium and ATP. Whereas fructose, this requires a protein transporter called GLUT, the glucose transporter, and it is a facilitative process, and the fructose enters, is absorbed and utilized in our body. So this was a basic mechanism which is involved. And interestingly, just to tell you, you might have heard of the oral rehydration syrup, which is given in case of dehydration. What does this contain? It is a mixture of salt and sugar or glucose. And now you would understand why salt is added, or sodium. Salt is what? Sodium chloride. Because the absorption of glucose is facilitated by an active transport which requires sodium. That is why you will realize that for the ORS it is always a sugar salt solution. Therefore, this is about the absorption of carbohydrates in our body. Now, with this basic understanding, let us move on to dietary fibers. While talking about polysaccharides, we talked about dietary fibers. What are dietary fibers? If you look at the monitor, a simplest definition: the component of plant cell wall that are indigestible in the human small intestine. This we have talked earlier, that the polysaccharides, particularly in the context of non-starch polysaccharides, we said they are not utilized by the body because the enzymes are not present. But this is limited. This definition, initial definition, is limited in its scope. Therefore, the American Association of Cereal Chemists have come up with a more recent and update definition, which takes the other aspects of dietary fiber as well. And this definition is, I would like you to look at the monitor. I have spelled it out for you people. This definition says that dietary fiber is the edible part of plants or analogous carbohydrates that are resistant to digestion and absorption. Please mark, they are resistant to digestion and absorption in the human small intestine. Second aspect, with complete or partial fermentation in the large intestine. First, they are resistant to digestion with complete or partial fermentation in the large intestine, and examples of this include polysaccharides, oligosaccharides, lignin, associated plant substances. In addition to this, dietary fibers promote beneficial physiological effects including laxation and or blood cholesterol attenuation and or blood glucose attenuation. You see, through this definition, the different aspects or the characteristics of dietary fiber have been brought in. First, we say that they are resistant to digestion, but they are partially, or it says complete or partial fermentation can take place in the small intestine by the action of the bacteria, and it has a physiological effect in terms of laxation and in terms of cholesterol attenuation and glucose. We will take up these aspects subsequently as we talk about dietary fibers. Now, moving on to dietary fibers, let us look at the components. What are dietary fibers? What are its different components? We can define or classify dietary fibers on the basis of solubility. Solubility, how they do they dissolve in water, hot water or not? Based on the solubility, they are insoluble dietary fiber and soluble. Examples of soluble, or let us take the insoluble dietary fibers. They are cellulose, some hemicellulose and lignins. These are the examples of insoluble dietary fiber. The soluble ones are pectin, gums, mucilages and some hemicelluloses. This is one classification. Besides the solubility, the classification based on solubility, they can also be classified based on the location on the plant. Based on this, if you look at your monitors, they are classified as plant cell wall constituent when they are present in the cell wall. Lignin, cellulose, hemicellulose, pectin, and those which are non-plant cell constituents, gums, mucilages, algal polysaccharides, suberin, cutin. Just to give you an example, if you make a cut on the bark of the tree, the fluid which comes out, that is the gum. That in itself, you see, is a non-plant cell constituent. It is a dietary fiber. It is classified as a dietary fiber. Now, what are these cellulose, hemicellulose, pectin? We have talked about these dietary fibers. What are these? What are its properties? And what are the food sources for these? Let us quickly review these. If you look at your monitors, let's start with cellulose. Cellulose, we said, is insoluble dietary fiber, but it can be modified chemically to be more soluble. And it is poorly fermented by colonic bacteria. The foods which are rich are bran, legumes, peas, vegetable of cabbage family, outer covering of seeds, apples. These are rich sources of cellulose. Next, let us look at hemicellulose. Hemicellulose, those that contain acids, are slightly charged and are water soluble. So some hemicellulose, we learnt earlier, are soluble, some are insoluble. The ones which are slightly charged are water soluble, and those which contain acid. Fermentation by intestinal flora is influenced by the sugars and the position. For example, hexose and uronic acid are more accessible to bacterial enzymes. And where do you find hemicellulose? The food sources are wheat bran. Wheat bran is the covering of the wheat, and whole grains. These are the rich sources of hemicellulose. The next, let us take up pectin. They are water soluble and gel forming fibers. They have an ion binding potential, and they are completely metabolized by the colonic bacteria. The examples are apples, guava, strawberries, citrus fruits. Few examples to tell you where pectin is available. Lignin is the next dietary fiber. It is highly insoluble in water. It is not fermented by the colonic microflora or the bacteria. Where do you find them? Mature roots, vegetables such as carrots. You will find them in wheat, fruits with edible seeds such as strawberries, just to give you a few examples of these rich food sources. Next, let us look at beta-glucan. Now this is another component of dietary fiber. It is soluble and it hydrates. Hydrates means it absorbs water and swells. It has a well-forming viscous solution and are often referred to as food gums or mucilages. Where do you find them? You find them in grains, cereal grains, especially barley and oats. Next, move on to gums. They are water soluble. They are highly fermented by colonic bacteria. Oatmeal, barley, legumes, these are some important food sources of gums. So this was the list can go on, and for other examples or components, you can look up your Unit 3 in the Advanced Nutrition course, which talks about these polysaccharides. In fact, even in the Principles of Food Science course, the Unit 2 is totally devoted to these polysaccharides and their properties and their role in the body. Now, why dietary fibers? Why are we talking about dietary fibers? What is their importance? What are the properties which lend themselves to play a very important role in our body is what we will take up next. And if you look at your monitors, the properties or characteristics are highlighted there. These properties, can we have the slide please? The first is the solubility in water. The fibers we've talked about, they are insoluble, soluble. Solubility in terms of whether they dissolve in hot water, they are soluble, which do not, they are not soluble. So the solubility in water influences their effect on other body. The second property is the hydration or the water holding capacity. Fibers are like sponge. When you put a sponge in water, it absorbs water. Similarly, fibers, the hydration property or the water holding capacity of the fiber will influence its impact or its effect or its role, the physiological role in the body. We will see in a little while. Other than this, the third aspect is the absorption attraction. That is the ability to bind to organic and inorganic molecules. It absorbs to certain molecules and prevent their absorption from the small intestines, and hence it plays an important role. So the absorption properties of dietary fiber are important aspect to consider. And the last aspect is the degradability or the fermentability of the dietary fibers. Fermentation, we have already talked a little while that they can be broken down in the intestine by the colonic bacteria, and this aspect plays an important role or a physiological role. Because of this, dietary fibers have an important role. Let us take each one of these aspects which I have discussed, the properties which I have talked about, and go into further details to see how those impact the solubility of dietary fiber in the body, how it impacts on its role. Fiber that dissolves in hot water are soluble, we've already told you that, and those are insoluble. So how does soluble fiber impact? They delay the gastric emptying. They increase the transit time through the intestine and decrease the nutrient absorption. By being there, these are the effects they have on the body. Similarly, the insoluble fibers. What do the insoluble fibers do? If you look at your monitor, the insoluble fibers, on the other hand, decrease the intestinal transit time and they increase the fecal bulk. How? By being there, they absorb water and they increase the fecal bulk, and therefore they help or play an important role in our body. So this is about the solubility. How solubility as a factor or a characteristic influences or has a role in our body. Next, let us look at the water holding or the hydration capacity, what is called as the WHC, the water holding capacity of dietary fiber, and viscosity, how it influences. See, WHC refers to the ability of a fiber to bind water, and there are various factors which influence this water holding capacity. How soluble it is, the pH in the gastrointestinal, whether it is positive or negative, and the size of the fiber particle. Is the dietary fiber particle coarse or is it finely grounded? These will influence the water holding capacity. And let us look at the physiological effect the water holding capacity or this characteristic has. Look at the monitors, you would see fibers such as pectin, gums and some cellulose have a high water holding capacity, and these fibers, what they do, they delay the emptying of food from the stomach. And by doing that, what happens, that all the nutrients present in the food can be easily absorbed through the small intestine, and hence they can impact on the body processes. Other than delaying emptying of food from the stomach, it reduces the mixing of gastrointestinal content with digestive enzymes. You see, any food which enters the stomach, it has to be mixed with the enzymes to be acted upon, and these dietary fibers, they reduce the mixing of the gastrointestinal content with the digestive enzymes. The third is it reduces the enzyme functioning, which we have already kind of touched in the previous point, and then it decreases the nutrient diffusion rate and delayed nutrient absorption. Naturally, it delays the nutrient absorption and it alters the small intestine transit time. Therefore, these are the ways by which the water holding capacity or this characteristic of dietary fiber impacts on the physiological role in our body. Other than this, let us look at the third characteristics, which is the adsorption or the binding ability. Some fiber components have the ability to bind. The adsorption in terms of binding, they bind substances in the gastrointestinal tract. Examples like wheat bran, guar gum, some lignins, they have shown to bind bile acids in the small intestine, and this property is particularly important when we talk of the lipid metabolism in terms of cholesterol metabolism. We will see in a little while from now. Therefore, this adsorption property is very important, and it has a very important role in our body. The next aspect which we are going to take is the physiological effect of ingestion of fibers with adsorption properties. What are the effects this has? It has a diminished absorption of lipids, I have already talked about. It increases the fecal excretion of bile acids. By the bile acids being adsorbed to the fiber, it cannot be reabsorbed and recirculated. Therefore, this bile acids can be excreted out of the body. In addition to this, the hypocholesteremic property, that is lowered cholesterol level. By hypocholesterolemia, you know what it means, lowered cholesterol level, and dietary fiber, by having the adsorption properties, it results in a hypocholesterolemic effect. And other than this, the adsorption property also has an effect on the altered mineral balance. How this happens, we will see in our next slide a little while from now. But first we will talk about the fourth aspect, which we talked about, fermentability or digestibility of the dietary fiber, which impacts on the or which has an important role to play. How soluble fractions, especially like pectin, gum, mucilages, algal polysaccharides, they are very accessible and they ferment rapidly in the intestine. And I will give you a flow chart of how the degradation takes place. But the insoluble fibers fraction, the solubles are easily fermentable. The insoluble, they too are fermentable, but very slowly. Now, what is this process? What happens? The first step in this process of fermentation is that all the carbohydrates like the oligosaccharides, the disaccharides, they are first acted upon by the enzymes and broken down into simple carbohydrate units, the simple monosaccharide unit, which is glucose, fructose, galactose. Now this glucose, which is then the carbohydrate, glucose, is then broken down to produce pyruvate. And if you look at your monitors now, you will see this entire process. This pyruvate is then further broken down into short chain fatty acids. This is the effect of fermentation, the colonic fermentation in the intestine by the bacteria. They break down the carbohydrate into pyruvate. The pyruvates are further broken down into the constituents like the short chain fatty acids, of which acetate, propionate and butyrate, they are the important short chain fatty acids which are used. The acetate and the propionate, these are further broken down to release energy, whereas the other constituents like carbon dioxide, hydrogen, methane gas, these are also produced by the fermentation, and this is released to the flatus and through breath, that is through the lungs, it is excreted out of the body. Short chain fatty acids also play a very important role, as you will see subsequently in our discussion. Therefore, the fermentation of these so-called unavailable carbohydrates is important, and they play an important role in our body. With this basic understanding, let us then look at the overall effect of dietary fiber, or the functions or physiological effect in our body. The first foremost is satiety, that is dietary fiber help in giving a feeling of fullness. The presence of fiber, we've talked about the water holding capacity, because of which they swell up and they delay the gastric emptying time, and therefore the food stays in the stomach for a longer time and gives a feeling of fullness, and therefore people do not feel hungry quickly. Therefore it has a satiety value. Next point is the nutrient absorption. Inclusion of fibers have been shown to retard the absorption of some nutrients. We have already talked about guar gum, pectin have shown to be beneficial in controlling hyperglycemia. Earlier we talked about cholesterol. Even glucose. What dietary fiber do? These molecules they bind to dietary fibers and they are prevented from being absorbed, and hence they have a hypoglycemic effect on the body. They lower or they control hyperglycemia in the body. Now, what is the mechanism involved in this nutrient absorption or aspect which we have just talked about? You see, what it does, it increases the viscosity of the gastrointestinal content and thus delays absorption. Besides increasing the viscosity, the other effect, it affects lipid absorption. How? By their ability to absorb fatty acids and cholesterol. As you have said that bile acids and phospholipids, they are required to form micelles, and that's how the fats are used up. By preventing this, therefore it affects the lipid absorption. The next aspect or the next point which needs to be considered is the third, where the nutrients are sequestered within the cellular matrix and are hence made unavailable for absorption. In addition to this, the altered mineral availability which we talked about earlier is associated with diets high in fiber, and this is due to the binding of metal ions. Rapidly fermentable fibers release the bound mineral as fermentation occurs, and these minerals may possibly be absorbed in the colon. So basically, by binding to the metal ions, they prevent dietary fibers prevent the absorption of minerals. Well, this can be a negative aspects as well. For example, certain phytates present in cereals, well, they can also bind to iron and hence prevent its absorption. That's a different aspect, but it has a role in binding, in what we call as the binding of metal ion, and it plays an important role in this aspect. Other than these two functions I've just talked about, let's move on to the third function of dietary fiber, which is that it helps in maintaining integrity of gut or the colon. How? Dietary fibers, especially the fermentable fibers, they play an important role by maintaining the integrity. We've talked about the short chain fatty acids which are generated and during fermentation, and they stimulate the proliferation of mucosal cells in the gut and thus maintain its integrity. The other thing is the stool weight and laxation. The mechanism by which it functions is through the water holding capacity. The cereal fiber have the greatest fecal bulk power. Therefore, these are what we talked about are the basic functions, and because of these properties, you see, fiber has a very important role to play, particularly role to play in cancers, in preventing cancers and preventing heart diseases. Let us quickly run through the next 2-3 slides to give you how it affects. If you look at your monitors, dietary fiber and colon cancer, how it affects. Several mechanisms have been postulated. The first, fiber that increases stool bulk results in the dilution of carcinogens. Fibers also decrease transit time, thereby reducing the interaction of the carcinogens with the colonic mucosal cell. So what you see is the first possible mechanism by which the fibers can prevent. Let us look at the other mechanisms. Fiber binds to potential carcinogens and thus prevent their absorption. High bile acid concentrations are associated with high risk of colon cancer, and we've already studied earlier that fibers absorb bile acids, thereby reducing the risk. Then the next is fiber by providing fermentable substrates. They alter the species and number of microorganisms which may inhibit proliferation of tumor cells or conversion of pro-carcinogens to carcinogens. Now this is one possible mechanism by which they may act upon. Quickly, the other one, we've talked about the short chain fatty acids. They reduce the pH, which in turn reduces the synthesis, and there are other mechanisms which have been talked about, like this. the dietary fibers also impact the cardiovascular diseases quickly. Evidence suggests that fibers naturally present in food reduce total cholesterol and the LDL cholesterol. The mechanism is more or less the same. Oat bran reduces cholesterol, wheat bran, for example, may not. So there are different fibers which have different properties. The basic factors or characteristics which influence these are the water holding capacity we've talked about, the solubility we've talked about, the absorption, and we have talked about lastly the fermentation of these, which have beneficial effect for cancers as well as for cardiovascular diseases. So with this we would like to end our discussion on carbohydrates, and we hope you've got a good understanding of the simple carbohydrates like the monosaccharides and the disaccharides, the oligosaccharides and the polysaccharides, particularly the dietary fibers and their physiological effect in the body. Thank you.